A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this special tribute episode about the life and legacy of Rabbi Berel Wein is sponsored by one of Rabbi Berel Wein's beloved grandchildren in honor of his grandfather's memory, and that it's our hope that the listeners will be inspired by his story and follow in his legacy in finding any way and doing whatever can be done to impact, assist, build, and produce for the Jewish people, bringing them even closer to Hashem, as this is the entire goal of this tribute, to inspire others, to goad others, and to motivate others moved by his life, accomplishments, and legacy. So this episode will be more about my personal relationship with Rabbi Wein and his impact on my own life and eventually career. I think that would be kind of limiting it, because there's so much to say about Rabbi Wein in general, and his biography, and his accomplishments, and his impact in Jewish history. So I decided was that perhaps there'll be a part 2 next week, which will be more focused about him in general, about his biography and accomplishments, whereas this week I'll do more about my personal relationship with him, his influence on my life and career, and I feel like it's just imperative to do this tribute because we had this very close relationship, and therefore it might need to be a second part. We'll see at the end. We'll see how it goes. Might not be need a second part. I needed a week to process. He passed away a week ago. I attended the funeral. I visited the Shiva, and I couldn't just put one on the next day. It just that's I don't know. It's just my personality. I also had a final summer trip last week, and I thought about, while I was on this trip, the irony of being unable to do a tribute for Rabbi Wein because of a Jewish history trip, which that entire career I kind of owe to him. So, it's his fault that I wasn't able to do the tribute for him, in a way. Now, way before I knew him personally, I grew up with his books and cassette tapes, as I assume many others did as well. And in those days it was cassette tapes and his early history books. He had this prodigious output of books over the decades, and by now I think he has well over 30 books published. In those days there were very few. It was his classic coffee table history books, and a few others that we had in the house, and I read very eagerly. I lapped it up. And many, many different Jewish history series of his cassette tapes. And that was literally my earliest exposure to Jewish history. That's where I got my love and passion for Jewish history, and it came directly from there. There wasn't anything else in those days. And I remember specifically, even from that early age, which books and lecture series of his I resonated with me more, and that kind of, till today, is my specific focus and research of Jewish history. I think it was his very first book, Triumph of Survival, which focuses on the modern era, I enjoyed much more than the other books, Echoes of Glory, Herald of Destiny, or the other ones, which focused on earlier eras. He had on Tanaim and Amoraim, and on several other on the early eras. And right away, modern Jewish history resonated with me more. And then later on, he published his greatest book, but that's just my personal opinion, Faith and Fate, the Story of the Jews of the 20th Century, which later became a documentary movie series as well. and the 20th century, of course, remains a strong focus of mine. And in his lecture series, what I enjoyed very much in those early years was some of those series on modern Jewish history, especially on Hasidus and on the Lithuanian yeshiva world. And later on, I think that came later, his series on tzaddikim, great Torah leaders, personalities that he personally knew and interacted with and had a great relationship with. I love that because I always saw him more as a bridge to Jewish history, more than just a teacher of ancient Jewish history. And his stories and his interactions with the Panovich Rav and the Satmar Rav and Rabbi Kamenetsky and his Rebbeim in Chicago, Reb Chaim Kreisworth, Reb Mendel Kaplan, and Reb Alexander Rosenberg in the OU, and many, 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 many others. Ironically, his Pesach Haggadah was one of my favorites. He told me that his Pesach Haggadah he almost wrote as an afterthought, like he did it because Art Scroll encouraged him to do it, and he just wrote it in a few weeks, like just off the cuff. He didn't do any research. He just wrote his own impressions and feelings, and he didn't consider it one of his more serious or important works. And yet I think that's why I liked it so much. It was that sense of history. It was very raw. It was very personal. I felt like I was sitting at his Seder table when I read his Pesach Haggadah. It was not only the sense of history on such a historical night, such as the Pesach Seder, but also his sense of humor. It was full of his classic, typical jokes. I remember just offhand, he wrote in there about how one of his jobs was to prepare the charoses at his Pesach Seder. And he wrote that his charoses recipe is so secret that even he doesn't remember it from year to year. Right? Just like a very typical dry humor. Now, later on came his videos, and I used to attend the premieres of those videos, and he always talked about how he embraced technology, multimedia, reaching the Jewish people and interacting with them and teaching history to them through all kinds of technological means, animation videos, documentary videos, and his weekly email newsletters, which came relatively early on before it was popular. He even was on Israeli TV for a bunch of years. He had this incredible wide reach of his educational activities, from delivering a typical Gemara shir, either to his Talmidim in yeshiva or to his Balabatim in shul, to, a video, a movie, right? Either way, that was my exposure to him before I got to know him personally. But then I arrived in the Mir when I was 18 years old, and in 2003, and in my dira in the Mir was a grandson of his, my dear friend Binyamin Teitelbaum, and I discovered that he was Rabbi Wein's grandson, and I said, "Whoa! I was always a big fan of your grandfather. I always loved his tapes and his books, and I know that he retired for Monsey Yerushalayim. So he lives in Rechavia, and I'm assuming that you go to him to visit. Can I come along with you?" So Binyamin started to bring me along with him for Shabbos meals. So we would go walk from the Mir to Rechavia and eat by him on Shabbos. And that started my personal relationship with him, started to be his Shabbos guest on a relatively regular basis. There quite often. And Shabbos meals didn't just mean the Shabbos meal. We would go daven at Beit Knesset Hanasi, his beloved shul in Rechavia, where he was the rabbi in his later years. And we would daven there. And then after davening, we would walk him home. And then we would eat the meal by his house. It was a whole thing. And it was a lot of fun. And we really got to know him and really got to schmooze with him and ask him questions. And I probably drove him insane with all the questions I asked. But I do remember, although it was gradual, we developed a relationship over time. And I came so many times to his house that over time, and obviously these processes are very gradual, but I do remember there was one moment where I changed from just a typical Shabbos guest that his grandson brought along from the Mir to maybe someone that we can have a different kind of relationship as a mentor and mentee kind of, or a guide and guidee, is that a word even? And it was probably the second or third time, I don't remember exactly, where we were eating by him, where I was eating by him. And he was discussing the Kutzker. And the Kutzker was one of his favorite personalities from Jewish history. He had a lot of favorite personalities. His most favorite, by far, was the Rambam. He loved the Rambam. He always talked about the Rambam, made an animation movie about the Rambam. He lectured about the Rambam. He was obsessed with the Rambam, and for obvious reasons, he loved his rationality and his place in history and his life story and his challenges that he overcame and his hyper rationality. In fact, he said that if there was one personality he could meet from Jewish history, he would choose the Rambam to talk to him. He said to me once in a more cynical way, I asked him once at a Shabbos meal if different personalities from Jewish history would come back and view the Jewish world today, what, in his opinion, would their reaction be? So he says to me, the Rambam would be horrified. So that was his take. He did say in the context of the Kotzker, because we're talking about the Kotzker in a second, he did say that the Kotzker would be, impressed. I don't forget the word he used, would be happy, would be impressed, would be, okay with the Jewish world today, which surprised me because the Kotzker was known to be very, critical and very sharp and very demanding. But he explained that, in Polish Hasidus, till today, the descendants of Kotzk, in his teachings, they very much don't have that ostentatiousness. They very much have the simplicity. There's a certain emes to it. There's a certain no shtick about their way, and a way of life. And he thought the Kotzker would be impressed by that. That still there's certain elements of his teachings that remain with Polish Hasidus until this very day. In any event, he was talking about the Kotzker at this second or third time I was there for Shabbos, and he mentioned something during the Yemei Hesker, what's referred to the last two decades of the Kotzker's life, where he was in somewhat seclusion. It wasn't total seclusion, but somewhat seclusion. And he said even during those years of seclusion, the Kotzker didn't keep his house closed to wildlife to a certain extent. In other words, windows and doors. There was he felt that V'rachamav al kol masav. He would talk about V'rachamav al kol masav, the pasuk in Tehillim, that Hashem's mercy is on all His creatures, and therefore mice and birds and insects, mosquitoes, they can have free reign throughout the house, and no one's allowed to swat them, no one's allowed to kill them, no one's allowed to set traps for them. And it was an interesting approach of the Kotzker, which obviously was revolutionary, just like everything else about the Kotzker. And then, as he's finishing his little, insight about the Kotzker, Rabbi Wein said, the Kotzker had a reverence for life. So I said to Rabbi Wein at the Shabbos table, in the middle of the Cholent or something, I said, it's interesting that you're using the phrase coined by Albert Schweitzer, reverence for life, and you're applying it to the Kotzker, which would mean that, in your opinion, in your view, there's a certain, even though these two personalities, Albert Schweitzer and the Kotzker, were so different, but you're seeing a certain parallel between these two in their reverence for life. And I'm curious as to, can we explore that parallel and what you mean by that? And he gives me this look. I'll never forget that look. And the looks, he didn't say anything. The look said, who in the world did my grandson start bringing to my Shabbos table? Why is he noticing this phraseology of Albert Schweitzer? And I don't even remember what he answered, but I do remember that from that moment on, he treated me differently. This wasn't just another friend of his grandson from the Mir. This was a guest at his Shabbos table that he can have a conversation with, and I felt very honored by that, and it was a privilege to have had that relationship, and I loved it, and I thrived on it, and so I remember when we would go to Beit Knesset Hanasi. So Beit Knesset Hanasi is a wonderful shul. I love the shul. He loved the shul. It's a beautiful shul. Great people there. But it's what we would say, it's not exactly a black hat crowd. Very, very religious, very, 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 very Torah-dic and everything, but not exactly a black hat crowd. So whenever there were black hats there, he knew that they were his guests because it meant his grandson brought a bunch of Bacharim from the Mir, so they were the black hats in the crowd. So, and he wore a black hat too. So it was him, and then in the back of the shul was a bunch of other black hats that were obviously his guests. So after shul, he would boom his booming voice, "All black hats a lie." His way of calling us over. So he would tell us stories. His great sense of humor, his jokes, and we would get to see his library. We'd go to peruse his books. Occasionally, I would even borrow a book. I remember at one Shabbos meal we ate by him, Shabbos Purim. It was a Purim Meshulash in Yerushalayim, and the Shabbos is Purim. So I needed a break from all the wild meals, so I knew that it would be more subdued by Rabbi Wein. So Shabbos day of Purim, I ate by him, and he obviously, it wasn't going to be a wild drunken party by his house. It was a more dignified situation, so that was nice. And he mentioned, or his grandson maybe mentioned at the meal, that there is some sort of opinion that even though on Shabbos Purim we don't observe all the Purim stuff, the meal and the Purim Suda and everything is the next day on Sunday, and some of it is the previous day on Friday. But there is an opinion that one should drink wine on Shabbos, at the Shabbos meal on Shabbos Purim. Now there is another opinion of the Ramah that one does not need to get drunk on Purim, one can just take a nap. So therefore his grandson, his big Lamdan grandson, whoever it was, he had many Lamdanim grandchildren, has many Lamdanim grandchildren. He said, therefore it would be suffice if we just had a glass of wine by the meal and then took a nap Shabbos afternoon afterwards, and then we're Yaitzazayin all the opinions. So Rabbi Wein seemed to like that because he always had a glass of wine by the meal, very classy. By the way, he wore a smoking jacket by the meals. It was really cool. I remember when he bought the smoking jacket, he was very proud of it. He wore like one of these old aristocratic British smoking jackets. He never smoked. He just wore a smoking jacket by his Shabbos table. In any event, so he drank a glass of wine, and then after the end of the meal, he was planning on going to take a Shabbos afternoon nap. And he says, "Hareini muchan lekayim mitzvahs adelo yoda," and he went to take his nap. Another thing about his more humorous side is that lighter side. I wouldn't call it humorous side. Lighter side is that it seemed that he was a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan, even though he was a big Rav and Rosh Yeshiva and world-renowned historian and was a Torah leader and a Torah teacher, but he was still a Chicago Cubs fan. And being a Chicago Cubs fan in those days, until they finally won again, I don't know when it was, like 10 years ago or so, but it was, it's a lot of Mesiras Nefesh, a lot of dedication to the cause, because they had I think it was the curse of the Billy Goat. They didn't win World Series. So Rabbi Wein used to tell us, everyone can have a bad century once in a while. I felt that was combining the historian Rabbi Wein with the Chicago Cubs fan Rabbi Wein. Everyone can have a bad century once in a while. Rabbi Wein I always saw him as very balanced. Was never on the extreme side, very like old school Litvak kind of. I remember he said a story about his growing up in Chicago, and one of his Rebbeim there was Rav Herzl Kaplan, the older brother of another one of his Rebbeim there, Rav Mendel Kaplan. Rav Mendel Kaplan was more famous in Chicago and also later as a Rebbe in Philadelphia Yeshiva. So Rabbi Wein was a student of both, of Herzl Kaplan and Rav Mendel Kaplan, and he said loads of stories about both. So one of the stories I remember that he spoke about Rav Herzl Kaplan was that Rav Herzl Kaplan kept his tzitzis tucked in. And Rabbi Wein and his friends asked him why he did that. If a Rebbe, big Rebbe in a very chashuv yeshiva, why was he tucking his tzitzis in? So Rabbi Herzl Kaplan said that I'm aware that many of you are going to end up in law school and in medical school and in places like that, accounting, other places of higher education and professional settings. And this is Chicago, the 1940s and 50s. And he said, in Chicago in the 1940s and 50s, you wouldn't be able to walk into a courtroom as a litigator with your tzitzis out and the judge would respect you. It wouldn't happen. it just would not happen. In the environment of America in those days, in the professional workforce or in the professional educational arena, you wouldn't be able to walk around with your tzitzis out. Obviously, America has changed, but in Chicago in the 1940s and 50s, that was the reality. And therefore, you're going to feel that since the only way to wear your tzitzis is to wear it out, and since you can't wear it out at this point in your career, so you'll just stop wearing them. So therefore, now in yeshiva, I'm going to wear them tucked in to show you that you can wear tzitzis tucked in and it's just fine. So that when the time comes, you can wear them tucked in and you'll never take off your tzitzis. He said that was a very guiding story for him, that sense of balance and priorities and what's ikr and what's tough, what's important, what's not less important, but not as important, I'll say. He told me a story, told this to me a few times at his Shabbos table, about a student of Rabbi Wein's, a student of his, who brought his son before his bar mitzvah to Rabbi Wein to get a blessing. And he asked the bar mitzvah boy, "Are you excited for your bar mitzvah?" And the boy said, "Yes, I'm very excited." And Rabbi Wein said, "Why are you excited?" And the boy said, in the same breath, he said, "Because I'm going to get to wear tefillin and wear white shirts." So he said in the same breath. And Rabbi Wein, he didn't say anything to the bar mitzvah boy. He just smiled and gave him a big blessing and very warm. He said to me afterwards, he would never say this to a 13-year-old kid. He says to me afterwards, he said, "There's the problem. White shirts is wonderful. Uniform of the yeshiva student and the distinctive dress of a yeshiva student. That's great. It's beautiful. Why not? But it's definitely not as important as tefillin, right? Tefillin is certainly on the order of magnitude much, much more important than white shirts." And let's say this boy, as a teenager, is going through something or whatever it is, and he stops wearing white shirts for whatever reason. In his mind, if they're equated, the two are equal. There's white shirts and tefillin are equal, then maybe he'll stop wearing his tefillin too. So we need to understand priorities. We need to understand balance. We need to understand what's important, what's, again, on a scale, what's on a spectrum, a scale, whatever it is less important. I remember once walking with him from Beit Knesset Anasi to his house, and there was one of the news items that we were schmoozing about was that there was this story somewhere in America, I forget where, that there was a yeshiva that was dealing with a court case because the neighbors of this yeshiva were bringing the yeshiva to court about zoning and stuff like that because they were upset about the noise that the kids were doing at recess. They were playing in the yard and making a lot of noise, and this was a suburban neighborhood, and the neighbors were very upset that this yeshiva had moved in and was making noise. And okay, that's standard. Unfortunately, that's to be expected. What was upsetting me with the whole story was that I discovered that the neighbors who were complaining about the yeshiva and literally bringing them to court about zoning issues were Orthodox Jews, right? If it's non-Jews, we could say, "Oh, anti-Semites," If it's non-Orthodox, you say, "Oh, they just don't like the Orthodox," or whatever you want to say. But here it's Orthodox Jews. How could they oppose them? And I was young, innocent at the time. I wasn't as cynical as I am today. And he looks at me, and he says, when I expressed my consternation, he says to me, "Yehuda, as mir lernt kit nit ken musser, what do you expect?" Meaning, and then he explained, he said, if they did not refine their character, they didn't work on being a good person, a good Oved Hashem, on understanding what their role in the world is, then what do you expect from them? Who cares if they're officially Orthodox Jews? They still cannot know how to behave, even if they're Orthodox. Also at a Shabbos Suda, I'm just remembering things from the Shabbos Suda. He once told me that a store in Rechavia opened on Shabbos. And there was a rabbi who he had a close relationship with in nearby Sharei Chesed, who was like an old school Yerushalmi type of rabbi, but he had a very good relationship with him. And this rabbi in Sharei Chesed was discussing with this problem with Rabbi Wein. He was complaining to him. He said, "Another store opened on Shabbos." So Rabbi Wein said to him, and Rabbi Wein shared this conversation with me, he says to him, "Have you ever visited the storekeepers in Rechavia and Sharei Chesed? How many times have you walked into the store and schmoozed and talked and developed a relationship with the store owner?" So the rabbi said, "Never." So he said, "Then why are you surprised that a store opened on Shabbos? You don't have a relationship with them, so they don't respect you." He said, "If you would just develop a relationship with these people as a human being, as a rabbi, then you would never even need to tell them to close their store on Shabbos, because they would respect the rabbi, even if they lead a secular lifestyle, but they would respect you. They would want to do things that please you, and they would want to respect your value system in the public space, because they have a relationship. It's all about human relationships, which I found to be a very powerful story, because more than a historian, he was a rabbi. He was in practical rabbinics, he was a genius. He wrote a book about his career as a rabbi, and he saw himself as a rabbi. In his subtitle of his autobiography, he didn't write a profile of a historian or of anything else. He wrote of a community rabbi. And this was Rabbinics 101 in his mind. At some point, I felt like the Shabbos Sudas weren't enough, so I asked him, does he have anything in general, like out there in that he does, like maybe a weekly lecture that I can attend, that I can get more on a more consistent basis? And he said, yeah, sure. He does lectures in Ar Sameach. Great. Ar Sameach is right next to the Mir. I don't even have to take off time from the Mir. It was at a good time of day that I wasn't missing anything, and it's literally 5 minutes from yeshiva. So awesome. I went to these Ar Sameach lectures, and then I did on a weekly basis. So now I'm seeing him weekly, and I'm hearing a lecture on Jewish history, and I would come with my pen and paper, and I wrote down these meticulous notes, which I still have and I still use. It was amazing. I was like living in those years. I did it for a few years, tried to never miss a week. It was like Gan Eden. I would go, I would make sure to be there early, get a good seat right near him. I would take those notes, and then as soon as the lecture was over, I'd walk over to him, and I would write down my questions during the lecture. There were guys who asked questions during the lecture. I wasn't that type. I don't know, I didn't have that personality. And I would write down the questions, and then I would walk him to his next. He gave a few shiurim in Ar Sameach. He loved teaching at Ar Sameach. He was there for decades. And I would walk him to his next shiur, and I would bombard him with questions. I probably drove him crazy. And I bombard him with questions on the lecture. It was a lot of fun. I was, gained a lot from that also. It was amazing is I'm sitting there taking notes. He didn't use notes. It was incredible. By his history lectures, I remember by his Shabbos Shuv and Shabbos Hagadol drushes, he did use notes. Interesting distinction. But by his history lectures at Ar Sameach, he did not use notes. And it was amazing. His knowledge was encyclopedic. That's pretty well known. I saw it in real time. It was really encyclopedic. He would ask, right next to him would sit Hanoch Teller, a good friend of mine, and a devoted student of Rabbi Wein. He was there for much longer than I was. I was only there for a few years as a single bacher. Hanoch Teller was there for decades, as far as I know, listening to Rabbi Wein's lectures. But in any event, Hanoch Teller would sit there with his computer, his laptop, and take notes. And so he would open his laptop, and he would have last week's notes there. So when Rabbi Wein would walk in without notes, he would say, Reb Hanoch, where are we holding? And Hanoch Teller would just read literally the last sentence from last week's lecture, and that was kind of like pressing play. And then he would just, boom, as soon as he told them the last sentence from last week's lecture, he would just go for an hour without stopping, without any notes, and just talk. It was unbelievable. During those lectures, his love for general history came out, which was fascinating to see. He loved American history. He loved specifically the Civil War, American Civil War. In fact, he told me that when he lived in America, during his summer vacations, he would visit Civil War sites. I wonder what if his kids loved that, because I know my kids can't stand when I take them to history sites. But he would go to he went to like literally every single Civil War site in America. Rabbi Wein also loved history of naval history, like admirals and naval battles, and he loved generals and stuff like that. Later on, I would also attend his book launches, which was another whole experience, because each book was different. Each time he had a different message that he was conveying, and I would get the book and get it signed by him and everything. And his speeches by book launches were much more broad, these sweeping speeches. It was amazing to see, and you got to see all the fans of Rabbi Wein. But then everyone would leave, and I would stay to the end because I was always with a couple of his grandchildren, either one of the Teitelbaums or my dear friend Yitzi Gettinger, who's now Rabbi Yitzchak Gettinger, a very prominent rabbi in New York. But we would stay to the end, and I remember once seeing him cleaning up at the end, like folding the chairs and putting away the speakers, the speaker system and everything, literally himself. He was in his, probably over 80 at the time, late 70s, early 80s, and it's his book launch, and he's the big celebrity, and this whole thing, and he's putting everything away. And I asked Yitzi, I said, what's going on? There's no one here to help him put it away? He said, you want to hear something crazy? He doesn't care. He's not looking for that. He sees that things need to be put away, so he's putting it away. He had no airs, no shtick, simplicity, either walked home or took a cab home afterwards. It was just no old Litvish world, old simplicity, nothing, none of that shtick. But I remember at a couple of great lines from his book launch speeches. I don't even remember which books it was, but one of his books was profiling different. It was a topical study. It was an interesting book. It was a topical study. I forgot what it's called. A very interesting book that he chose different topics and then went throughout history on that topic. Each chapter was a different topic, and then he would explore it through history on that topic, different from most of his other books. And there was an entire chapter on women in Jewish history. So the way he was discussing that chapter in his speech was, he tries in his setup, he's trying to be humorous, be funny. So he starts off by saying he's explaining why he has a chapter in the book on women, Jewish women in Jewish history. So he starts off, women have always been a problem throughout Jewish history. Like that's how he introduced it. One time he was speaking in his, which was a favorite topic of his, he was speaking about the move to the shift to the right, to extremism, to fanaticism, to chumras, to stringencies, and which he wasn't a huge fan of, being an old school Litvak. He was more, balanced, middle of the road, old fashioned, and so he discussed that a lot. He talked about it a lot. And one time in one of his book launch speeches, I remember him saying, speaking about this specifically, and then he adds on. He said, "In my refrigerator at home, I have a bag of celery. And the bag of celery has 5 hechsherim on it. Why do we need 5 hechsherim? What is each one adding that the other one doesn't have?" And then, which is just typical, I could almost see it's almost like a Seinfeld type of joke. He said, "And no one even eats celery in my house." It's meaning it's unrelated to the topic, but it was just a funny addition. He once told me how when he was the head of the kashrus at the OU, which is a whole other story of his life. So he told me that, he said, the religious lobby came into my office one day. And he said the religious lobby lobbied him to have OU remove its hechsher from peanut oil on Pesach. Kosher for Pesach peanut oil. Because peanuts are kitnius, and so therefore you can't have peanut oil with a OU hechsher. In those days it had a hechsher. I don't think it does anymore. But in Rabbi Wein's time it still did. Now, he obviously didn't put the hechsher on. It would remain there from before. How did it remain there from before? Because the peanut oil in the 1960s in the kosher peanut oil was from Rokeach Foods, Rokeach Foods, which Israel Rokeach was from Kovna. And when he produced peanut oil for Pesach and Kovna in the 1800s, he had the hechsher from no less than Rabbi Elchanan Spector, the Kovna Rav, who gave his own personal hechsher for peanut oil kosher for Pesach in Kovna for Rokeach. So he moved to America and he kept this hechsher from Rabbi Elchanan. So when the OU kashrus was established, they obviously kept this hechsher. They're not going to be the ones to remove the hechsher from Rabbi Elchanan. So today, they came, in the 1960s, the Jewish people was becoming more religious. So you could no longer have kosher for Pesach peanut oil. So they came to lobby the OU to remove it. So Rabbi Wein was the head of the OU kashrus at the time. So he said to the religious lobby, he said, I don't have the chutzpah to remove the hechsher of Rabbi Elchanan because the OU decided it's not good enough. Maybe someone will come after me and will do it, but I don't have the chutzpah, so please leave my office. That was his response. I think later on, the OU did remove the hechsher. He always talked about his relationship with his grandfather, Reb Chaim Tzvi Rubenstein, his mother's father. And to me, that was one of the most profound things that he could ever tell me, because his grandfather was a student of the Netziv in Volozhin, and where that places Rabbi Wein in Jewish history, and me knowing Rabbi Wein, where that places me in Jewish history, that someone who I was close with was a grandson and had a close relationship with a Talmud of the Netziv in Volozhin, and that makes that Volozhin much, much, much closer. In fact, he told a friend of mine, not me, this I didn't hear from him, he told a friend of mine that the first time he studied K'tzais HaChoshen, the classic yeshivish sefer of K'tzais HaChoshen, was with his grandfather. He learned K'tzais HaChoshen with his grandfather, Reb Chaim Rubenstein. Now, he was 12 years old when his grandfather passed away. So how old was he when he learned K'tzais HaChoshen with his grandfather? He was 9 years old. That's what he told a friend of mine. So when he's 9 years old, he's learning Chavrusa K'tzais HaChoshen with a student of the Netziv of Volozhin. To me, that was like, wow. Because when I was 9 years old, I never even heard of the K'tzais HaChoshen, and I probably opened it up for the first time when I was 18 when I arrived at the Mir. This Reb Chaim Rubenstein was Rabbi Wein's hero growing up. He always used to talk about how he gave up his entire savings for Holocaust rescue. Any money he had. That was how his grandfather lived. He also revered, one of the other people he revered was his father-in-law, Rabbi Eliezer Levine. Rabbi Eliezer Levine, the Rav of Detroit, who was a tremendous Rav and Tzaddik and Talmud and Torah scholar and leader, everything. And he told me so many stories about his father-in-law. There's, of course, the famous story about his father-in-law that he told everyone, that when his father-in-law was leaving Radin, he was a very close student of the Chavetz Chaim, and the Chavetz Chaim told him, Gei red zu Yidden. You're going to America, speak to Jews. And that was, his father-in-law saw that as his life's mission. Chavetz Chaim, which is, the most insightful person, the wisest person, the greatest tzaddikim who ever lived, he's telling his student, it was a close student, the Rabbi Levine was a Ben Bias, he actually lived in the Chavetz Chaim's home. So he was telling him, this is your life's mission, speak to Yidden, speak to Jews, which the Chavetz Chaim, of course, himself did. And Rabbi Wein kind of adopted that his father-in-law's mission from the Chavetz Chaim, he kind of adopted that himself. He spoke to Jews his whole life. His father-in-law was also a student of Kelm, he told me a great story from his father-in-law's rabbinate in Detroit. He told me when he was a young son-in-law, he came to his in-laws for Yontif in Detroit, and he noticed, it was right before Sukkot, he came for Yontif, he came for Sukkot, and he was the youngest son-in-law, I believe, and he saw on his father-in-law's table that there was an esrig box with an esrig inside, and on the esrig box there was written, his father-in-law had written a gift in honor of the great, in Hebrew, I don't know, I don't remember if it was in Hebrew or in English. It was written in honor of the great rabbi, and all these flowery titles, and then it said the name of the rabbi. The rabbi was the conservative rabbi in Detroit. The conservative rabbi in Detroit. And another son-in-law of Rabbi Levine was there. Rabbi Wein didn't like saying the name. Names aren't important. It's another son-in-law of Rabbi Levine was there. And he crossed out the flowery titles. He said it's inappropriate for his father-in-law to be writing these titles about a conservative rabbi. He's not so important. He's not such a tzaddik. He's not such a. Why are we writing titles like that for this conservative rabbi? And he said that Rabbi Wein said. And Rabbi Wein stayed out of this story. He wasn't. He was just an observer. So he told me that his father-in-law got upset. He said, "You're a young man, a young man." He said to his son-in-law. And he said, you're fiery and you're full of, religious passion, which is good. It's a good thing. But you have to understand the world and you have to understand the rabbinate. He said, once a year, I flatter this rabbi with these flowery titles, and I give him a gift as an expensive esrig for him to use on Sukkot. And because of that, once a year, I do this, I'm able to accomplish so much for the Detroit Jewish community because we have this relationship, and he respects me and I respect him. And therefore, when it comes to gittin and halachic divorce and kashrus and all kinds of things that I need from him and I need his help with, I get it. I'm able to get his help, and I'm able to work with him in helping Yiddishkeit in Detroit. And he's not opposed to me. He's not gonna stand in my way. We're gonna be able to work together just because of this. So that's something you have to understand how this works. And that was a profound insight for the young Rabbi Wein, the young impressionable Rabbi Wein. He used to say about his father-in-law, also in his classic cynical way, he would say, talking about the Jewish community in Detroit, what he did for them in Detroit. He saved them from the Fromme, and he saved them from the Freie. That's how he said it. One of his other favorite people was the Panovich Rav. When he was Rav in Miami, when he was a rabbi in Miami, he had a very close relationship with the Panovich Rav. Panovich Rav used to fundraise there, and they developed a very close relationship, closer than almost anyone else. He offered Rabbi Wein a position in Panovich Yeshiva as an administrator. He offered Rabbi Wein a free apartment in Bnei Brak to live there. Rabbi Wein turned them both down. But they were very, very close. Rabbi Wein said his Rebbe in fundraising was the Panovich Rav, and he was his Rebbe in a lot of other things. He really, really respected the wisdom, insight, vision, building skills, optimism of the Panovich Rav. He used to share about how the Panovich Rav used to tell him that even though he's the greatest fundraiser in the world, and the most famous fundraiser in the world, the most successful fundraiser in the world, every single time he knocks on the door to someone to raise money, he deep down in his heart he wishes that they will never answer the door, which is an insight into fundraising in general. Rabbi Wein used to love telling the story about how I heard this from him several occasions about how the Panovich Rav asked him to host a parlor meeting for young couples. Rabbi Wein told him young couples can't really donate much money. So he said, "No, don't worry about it. I have what to say to them." And when they came, the Panovich Rav, who lived with the trauma of the Holocaust his whole life, that defined his whole existence after the war. So he tells them there's 1.5 million children who were killed by the Nazis, who were killed in the Holocaust, who were murdered by the Germans and their collaborators, and they're waiting for neshamas. Their neshamas are waiting for bodies. Their neshamas are still around, and they're waiting for bodies. Please give these neshamas a body. And he was asking them to have children, to have more children. Rabbi Wein claims there was more children born in the demographics that year in Miami, which is amazing. Just the thinking of the Panovich Rav. He used to always quote the Panovich Rav about. Rabbi Wein asked him once, how are you so driven and motivated, this rebuilding? He was incessant. He was rebuilding orphanages and schools and yeshivas and girls' schools and more, and institutions and more and more and more. He never stopped. He never rested the Panovich Rav. And Rabbi Wein asked him, why are you so driven? How are you so driven? And the Panovich Rav said, when a father gives a punishment to his child, he has to give a petch. He has to give a punishment to his child. So afterwards, the father gives a shmeichel. He gives a smile because he wants to, balance it out. I had to give you this punishment, but for my own reasons. But now let's improve our relationship. Let me spoil you. Let me give you a smile. Let me give you goodies, and because I feel bad. I feel bad that I had to punish you. So he says, right now we're living in the shmeichel. And I don't know how long the shmeichel is going to last. I don't know how long the smile is going to last. So we got to build with an energy, because right now we have that shmeichel. So Rabbi Wein at his Shabbos table, I remember seeing, he used to show it to us, he had this little silver tray with Panovich Yeshiva engraved on it, meaning the building of Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak today, engraved on it, and that was a gift from the Panovich Rav. He used to also say stories about his relationship with the Satmar Rav. The Satmar Rav, Rabbi Eilish, used to come to Miami for the winters, and Rabbi Wein had a very close relationship with him, despite their different backgrounds, their ideological differences, their age differences, literally everything about them. But the Satmar Rav liked Rabbi Wein. Rabbi Wein liked the Satmar Rav, and they used to schmooze. They used to have a good relationship. The Satmar Rav used to use Rabbi Wein's mikveh. Rabbi Wein used to like to say that people said, who's this young, clean-shaven rabbi, at the time he was clean-shaven, building a mikveh? He knows how to make a kosher mikveh. And then the Satmar Rav said, yeah, he does, and I'm using it. And that, no one ever said a word about the mikveh after that. The Satmar Rav used to tell Rabbi Wein these great stories. Rabbi Wein later was the head of the kashrus in the OU, so he continued his relationship with the Satmar Rav because the Satmar kashrus used the OU for everything, right? They didn't have an infrastructure. They didn't have really anything going on. They were still, small, and so they used the OU. They on the public scene, they said they're much better than the OU. They're Heimische Hechsher, Satmar, but behind the scenes, they were just using the OU for everything. So when Rabbi Wein discussed this with the Satmar Rav said, "What do you want from me? My Hasidim are Hungarian Holocaust survivors. They came after the war. They need a parnasa. I was trying to think of any possible way I could get them to work and find a respectable parnasa. And a hechsher is a perfect idea. I got a lot of them jobs in opening a hechsher. So you need to give them a parnasa." He said that the Satmar Rav told Rabbi Wein that there was a Polish chassid in Williamsburg who had a butcher. A Polish Hasidim didn't speak Polish. They certainly didn't speak Hungarian. They spoke Yiddish. Most Hungarian Hasidim at that time, today Hungarian Hasidim speak Yiddish, but that's a transition that only happened in America after the war. Originally, Hungarian Hasidim spoke Hungarian, not Yiddish. So in Hungarian was like a holy language. So the Satmar Rav told Rabbi Wein that his Hasidim in Williamsburg, they won't buy meat from this Polish Chassid's butcher, because if the proprietor doesn't speak Hungarian, then it can't be kosher. So, in fact, Rabbi Wein recently, I think like a year or two ago, pretty recently, he was interviewed. I listened to the interview. It was phenomenal. It was so cool to hear him in Yiddish. There's this Satmar Yiddish like phone news service or something or another, and they interviewed Rabbi Wein in Yiddish about the Satmar Rav for the Satmar Rav's yard site, which is actually last week. I just realized that as I'm speaking, the Satmar Rav and Rabbi Wein will not will have their yard sites very close in proximity, like 5-6 days apart. Wow, interesting. So he was interviewed. So Satmar recognized Rabbi Wein's relationship with him, and they interviewed him as well. He had great stories with everybody. He was very close with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, enjoyed a especially close relationship. I don't recall any stories offhand now, but hopefully for part 2, we'll have some stories with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He also told a couple of stories of his interactions with Rabbi Cutler in the 1950s. He didn't have a relationship with Rabbi Cutler, but he had 2 stories that I remember with Rabbi Cutler. One was that Rabbi Cutler, one day he was still a lawyer back in the 1950s. He was still, before he became a rabbi, at Tzmicha. He was a part-time rabbi in Chicago, but he wasn't officially a rabbi. He was still a lawyer. And so he told me that one time his secretary said, "There's someone on the phone for you." He gets on the phone, and a voice in Yiddish says, "Ret da Cutler." That's how Rabbi Aaron used to answer the phone, introduce himself on the phone. And Rabbi Aaron says to Rabbi Wein, "Last year I came to Chicago to fundraise for my yeshiva in Lakewood, and you gave me $10 as a donation for my yeshiva. I'm old and sick and weak, and I can't make the trip to Chicago this year. Can you please still send the $10 donation by mail?" And Rabbi Wein, of course, did, but he was saying how we need to appreciate the growth of the Torah world in America. He said, look at Rabbi Aaron Cutler. He was chasing after $10 and apologizing that he couldn't come in person, and please send it again. That's how the Torah world was built in America in the 1950s. Today we reap the benefits. We have this huge Torah infrastructure, and we really, really should appreciate where we've came from. And the same with his second story with Rabbi Cutler. He said that he went with his father, Rabbi Berel Wein, or Zev Wein, or they called him Rabbi Chulin, he told me, because he was a Talmud of Reb Shimon Shkup. And at one point, the yeshiva didn't have an entire set of Shas, so a group of the older senior Talmidim were delegated to memorize different Masechtas of Shas, and they became the living Shas of yeshiva. And his father did Chulin, right? So he was Velvel Chulin. That was Rabbi Wein's father, who had also a very, very long life. I also was privileged to meet him once or twice. Lived till over 100, I think. In any event, he went with his father to Lakewood, also in the late 50s, early 60s, I don't remember. Rabbi Wein said that Rabbi Aaron took them on a tour around the Lakewood Yeshiva, and he pointed with pride at the Talmidim studying the Beis Medrash, and there were like 30, 40 students in Lakewood at this time in the 1950s. And Rabbi Aaron turns with this pride of his yeshiva and Beis Medrash, 30, 40 Talmidim. And, first of all, in Kletzky had 300-400 Talmidim, right? 300 probably. And look at Lakewood today, right? And there the yeshiva was 10 years old, 15 years old maybe, and it was 30, 40 students. And Rabbi Aaron turns to Rabbi Wein's father and him, and he says, you know what my dream is? One day, I'm going to have 100 Talmidim in this yeshiva. I'm going to have 100 students in this yeshiva. That was Rabbi Aaron's dream. I mean, again, to look at, Rabbi Wein was pointing out when he said this story, to appreciate where we've come from and how much, what was invested in that. Rabbi Wein, I think less people know this, but he basically was the founder of Telz Yeshiva in Chicago. He was still a layman in Chicago then in the 1960s, and Ramotel Katz, the Telz Rosh Yeshiva in Cleveland, asked Rabbi Wein to establish the yeshiva, to organize the establishment of the yeshiva, a branch of yeshiva in Telz, Chicago. And Rabbi Wein's brother-in-law, Rabbi Chaim Levine, the son of Rabbi Levine, became the Rosh Yeshiva, and later on Rabbi Wein's other brother-in-law, Rabbi Chaim Dev Keller, also became the Rosh Yeshiva, but Rabbi Wein was basically the founder. He was even flown in by the Telz Yeshiva of Chicago to speak at their, I guess, 50th anniversary dinner a bunch of years ago. Rabbi Wein used to talk about the formative events that shaped his life, that made him want to do so much for the Jewish people, for Hashem, teaching Torah, yeshivas, rabbanis, history, all that. He used to point to a few stories in his life that made the difference. His favorite story was talking about how he met Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel, when he visited Chicago in the late 1940s. And he spoke about how Rav Herzog related how he had met the Pope and tried to negotiate with him to be able to get all the Jewish children who had been hidden in monasteries and stuff like that across Europe during the Holocaust. But the Pope refused any assistance because once they were baptized, they're part of the church and they can never be returned to the Jewish people. And Rabbi Wein would describe how Rav Herzog started crying in front of them all. And then he looked up and looked at them, and it was the children in the audience, youth, American youth in Chicago. And he said, it's up to you guys, basically, to rebuild the Jewish people. You're the youth. I couldn't get back those children. But you are the future. You're the youth of the Jewish people. What are you going to do to rebuild the Jewish people? And he said that really moved him. And then when they went around to personally greet each person, each child, to greet Rav Herzog stopped each child and said, did you hear what I said? Did you understand what I said? What are you going to do to rebuild the Jewish people? Which has, had a profound impact on him. He also spoke about, Rabbi Wein was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, knew Shas, Paiskim, everything, Shulchan Aruch, everything. He knew it all. He delivered shiurim on every conceivable Torah topic, in his yeshiva, in his shuls, everything. He was a tremendous Torah scholar, and he wrote several svarim on Torah topics, and Shas, and Halach, and Drushes, and other things before he started writing Jewish history books. And he always spoke about how he never would say who it is. I'm always curious who it is. If anyone knows, please tell me. He met some tzaddik, someone in Yerushalayim one day, and he stopped him and told him, stop writing Svarim on Shas. We have enough people writing that. You have a unique talent, and you can teach the Jewish people their past and explain to them how powerful it is and how, the values that come out of that. You give this Torah view, this Orthodox view, this yeshiva view of history, that only you have this unique capability and talent that could do it. Focus on writing history, focus on teaching history. And that's when he transitioned to doing that. One of his talents was staying apolitical. He didn't join any of these political Jewish organizations, even though he was the head of the OU Kashrus. One of his favorite sayings that I heard from him probably 100 times was about how history is a rear view mirror. And I always loved that quote, and I use that on pretty much every single tour I do. Another quote of his that I like repeating is, I think it was being Menachem Avel, either his first wife or second wife, I don't remember which one it was, and I was by his house during Shiva, and there was a fellow sitting next to me, and they were talking about Rabbi Wein's grandchildren. Rabbi Wein loved his grandchildren. He had real pride. He loved talking about it. He loved talking about them. He had a lot of pride in his grandchildren, and he had many of them. And he was updating this fellow, who I guess knew Rabbi Wein many years. He said to him about a specific grandchild that he just started his first Torah teaching position. I don't remember if it was a shul rabbi or a teacher in a yeshiva, something like that. And then he adds on, he joined the family business, which to him was teaching Torah. And then he said something that just was so typical for him and just shook me. He said, and we must all realize that it's all of our family's business. That, in other words, teaching Torah is not a career move. It's everyone in their own life, to themselves, to their families, to their children, to their grandchildren, to the people around them. We all have responsibility to teach Torah in any way that we can. It's not just for official career moves. When I lived in Ramat Eshkol, before I moved out to Beit Shemesh, so I would walk from Ramat Eshkol to Rechavia twice a year to his Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol drushes, which was always fun, and it was a nice long walk. And it was amazing, to go. And those were works of art. It was a tapestry. It was incredible. He would weave halacha and lumdis and drush and stories and jokes and humor and cynicism and optimism and glory and it was amazing. That was oratory skills at the best I've personally ever seen in my life. I've never witnessed, Bill Clinton or other orators speak, but the limited exposure I've had to great speaking, he was the best at these moments. And I remember one time he cited a pasuk in Zechariah about the Geula, about the redemption, and about how it's describing these great visions of redemption. Everything's going to be awesome and great and cool, and we're going to finally be happy, and everything's going to be good. And then in the middle of all that, Zechariah Hanavi says that Va'az Yigdal HaMisped B'Yerushalayim, something along those lines. And then the mourning will be great in Yerushalayim. And Rabbi Wein asked, why? What are you talking about? Why is there going to be all of a sudden crying and mourning and eulogies? We're in the middle of the redemption. Everything's good now. So he said something, I think he was citing someone. I don't know if it was his own idea or he was citing someone else. It doesn't make a difference the way he said it. He said because when we're in the exile, we're in survival mode. We're either trying to survive the conditions of the exile, we're trying to survive Holocausts and October 7th and everything else in between, at an individual or national level, whatever we're going through personally also, or we're rebuilding from the most recent tragedy, destruction. We're rebuilding, and we have this look to the future and optimism and rebuilding, and let's move and let's build and let's build a new generation and let's look forward and that's what we're doing, one of the two. And therefore, we never have time to contemplate and to sit and mourn what we went through our long and very often bitter exile. So he said one of the things that will happen at redemption, at the Geula, is that we'll be able to mourn. We'll be able to cry. We'll finally be able to sit down and cry and mourn what we went through. And that idea blew me away. I don't know, it somehow resonated with me. And I don't think I ever yearned for the Geula more than at that moment, the way he said it, because I just wanted to be able to mourn. I wanted to have that opportunity to mourn. And after every time he gave the Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol drasha, I would go over to him and I would say, Rabbi Wein, it was amazing. Thank you so much. And I would always add on, it was well worth the walk from Ramat Eshkol to hear this. And he always gave me a smile. He was always excited to hear that. And one time he was overcome with emotion, but he was a big Litvak, so he couldn't really become overcome with emotion. So how did he express it? He hands me his handwritten notes from the Shabbos Hagadol drasha, and he says, "Here, Yehuda, I think you'll appreciate this." And I still have it. I still have it. I don't think it's going to end up on Genazim auctions anytime soon. I think I'm going to keep it. Now, once I started my career in Jewish history, so first of all, at the most basic level, I would use his books and his lectures and my own notes for all my early tours. And I built it around that. In other words, I modeled it basically on his stuff. And I remember sitting down and like I would in my early days and listening to some lectures again and writing notes down and using those notes on the tours, literally reading off of them. And when I was still, very new to the tour scene and had to every little bit I was using off him. But then I actually sat down with him when this was becoming more serious. And there was a few things that were bothering me. First of all, I knew that he had an ideological position about going back to Europe. He's from the older generation, and I understood it. That he didn't like, supporting these countries that killed us and giving them tourist dollars and going there where all this anti-Semitism was and how they threw us out and don't want to go back to these countries. He would do trips, but he would do trips to what he felt were more neutral places like Italy. I don't know It's neutral, but okay. Spain, I guess it's too long in the past. The more recent past was more traumatic. He would go to South Africa. He loved South Africa. I don't know if he would love it so much today, but he loved the country. He loved the Jews there. He loved the people there. He loved the history there. He loved the beauty of the country. He would go to these countries, but he would not go to Germany. He would not go to Poland. He would not go to Lithuania. He would not do it. And it was ideological. So, I'm like, he was my mentor in Jewish history, my guide in Jewish history, my teacher in Jewish history. So I asked him about it. I said, I know you have ideological opposition, but this is what people are doing. This is what they want to do. And this is where I kind of like found my niche. So he said, Yehuda, if this is what people want, and this is how they connect to Jewish history, then do it. What we want to do is bring Jewish history to the masses. That's our goal. We want them to connect to their roots. We want them to... I don't believe in it. I don't like these stuff, so I'm not doing it. But if this is what works for you, and this is what works for the new generation, then go ahead and do it. I love that pragmatic approach. He was so practical and so pragmatic, and that came out even more in my next question. I said, history for me was always a hobby, and it was always a passion, and it was always, something I loved, and to maybe a little bit of an extent it was also ideological, but I never dreamed that it would be a career. It kind of happened by accident, which is a whole other story, how it became a career. But it all happened by accident. I was never planning on it. So I asked him, should I be concerned that now it's not passionate, it's not ideological, it's just business, it's a way to feed my family, it's financial, it's transactional. Is that something that I should be concerned about? And he said the most pragmatic, practical thing ever. He said, Yehuda, the best thing that can happen to you is that it became a business. He said, if something's a passion, then it dissipates. If something's ideological, then it could dissipate. But if it's business, then you're making money from it. Then it lasts forever. Then you concretize it in a financial framework, in a business framework, and it lasts forever because it has to. You make your living from it. And then you don't have to be worried that it will dissipate and lose its fire and disappear completely. It will for sure last much longer, which I thought was incredible, out-of-the-box thinking, but very practical advice. He was not only a teacher of history for all eras, he was a bridge for history. He was from a different world. He connected that world, and even though he never considered himself a real historian, he never had a doctorate in history, never was a professor at a university, he saw himself as a teacher of Torah, Rosh Hashiva, a rabbi who dabbled in history on the side. He also had these opinions, and he had these succinct ways of expressing himself, and a lot of wisdom in the brevity. He would say how one must love all Jews, and he does love all Jews, and he loves loving all Jews, but then he would add, but it's very difficult to love all Jews. And another similar saying was that he would say, don't confuse Jews with Judaism. When you're disappointed with how sometimes Jews behave, Judaism is perfect. God is perfect. It's Torah, it's perfect. Sometimes people aren't perfect. Very opinionated. He would, one time in a lecture, I remember hearing him say, I realize that I'm, diverging from the facts now and sharing an opinion, but since I've never been wrong in my entire life, I feel I have a right to express my opinion, which I thought was pretty funny. I honored him at my chuppah to be a witness, to be one of the Eidim under the chuppah, him and my Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Elephant from the Mir, my main Rebbe. This is my history Rebbe, and my main Rebbe were the Eidim. And of course, the Rosh Hashiva Zatzal, Rabbi Nosson Finkel, was my Mesader Kedushin. He was the one who officiated at the wedding ceremony. So what is not well known is that the Rosh Hashiva Zatzal, Rabbi Nosson Finkel, who grew up in Chicago, obviously, and went to Skokie Yeshiva, went to Beis Medrash LaTorah, where Rabbi Wein was an alumnus of. Then it wasn't in Skokie, it was still in Chicago. And Rabbi Wein was older than the Rosh Hashiva. And Rabbi Wein, when he was in yeshiva, the older yeshiva students were supposed to tutor the younger students. And Rabbi Wein's tutoring partner, in other words, he was the tutor, and the one who was the tutee, or the student, I guess, was the Rosh Hashiva Zatzal, Rabbi Nosson Finkel. And Rabbi Wein tutored the Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Nosson Finkel, in Mishnayos in Chicago when he was a young child. And the Rosh Hashiva, to a certain extent, considered Rabbi Wein his first Rebbe, because he was his tutor in Mishnayos as a young child. And the Rosh Hashiva came to my chuppah, And I'm the chassan, right? I'm supposed to be the center of attention. Before the Rosh Yeshiva wished me Mazel Tov, before he started interacting with me, he first went over to Rabbi Wein, who was a witness, who was an aide under the chuppah, and wished him Shalom Aleichem, Mazel Tov, and then turned to me. I saw that with my own eyes and how, in my own chuppah, how the Rosh Yeshiva has respect for his first Rebbe, Rabbi Wein. And then, of course, at the end of the chuppah, so I'm closing the door to the yichud room, and the eidim now leave. That's what happens when they close the door to the yichud room. The last thing I hear as I'm closing the door to the yichud room was Rabbi Wein's booming voice talking to Rabbi Elephant. He says, "Well, Rabbi Elephant, it's been pleasant spending the evening with you." And that's the last thing I heard when I went to the yichud room. And it was pleasant spending all those years with Rabbi Wein. That's what I end off with. In recent years, in the last 10 years since I've been in Beit Shemesh and busy with my family and career and trips, I've kind of neglected our relationship, and I always feel bad about it and felt bad about it. I haven't visited him as often as I should. Busy life, occasionally a 30-second phone call. He didn't stay on the phone for longer than 30 seconds. Did visit him once or twice, but not enough. And the question is to live with those regrets or to appreciate what I did have, and that is, of course, a great philosophical question for another time. I think there's enough room, even though this is probably the longest episode I ever did. It's like an hour and a half long here. But I think there's still room for a second tribute. I'll have to decide if it's appropriate. I'll think it over this week. If not, then this will suffice. If yes, then there'll be a part 2 next week. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.